Now what we're going to build is we're going to add a custom block. We'll be using this for our sign up for the newsletter form element. This is going to use some of the techniques that we looked at in the previous exercise, but of course this will be very different since we are going to make our own custom block within our theme. WordPress blocks are fundamental elements that are used in the block editor. We can use them to create and format content within WordPress. Each block represents a specific type of content or layout component that can be added to post, pages, or custom post types. Blocks are useful because you can see your changes as you make them. They usually have a drag and drop interface, making it very easy to rearrange content. Blocks are made up of a modular design. Each block is independent, making it easy to structure content. Custom blocks allow developers to create specific blocks for unique content needs. In the previous exercise, I showed you how we could enter a custom form using a shortcode. I just wanted to give you an overview of the shortcode method versus the block method. Each one has its own pros and cons. Shortcode method is quick to implement. The block method is going to require that you use some JavaScript and other build tools. The shortcode will work in any editor or theme. The block method only works in block themes. With the shortcode method, it's easy to style with CSS. This is also true for the block method. When you use the shortcode method, it will not appear visually in the block editor. However, if you use the block method, you will be able to visually see it within the block editor. The shortcode method is not customizable by end users, but the block method is. The shortcode method does not require any sort of JavaScript in order to set up and build. However, the block method will require this. Let's dive into our WordPress website and make a custom block. Earlier in the course, we set up our own custom footer. I wanted to create an area where the user could join our mailing list. I just need a simple form field here where the user can enter their email address and then submit this information. We're going to go ahead and create a custom block for this particular element. Most of the work initially is going to be done in my code editor. So let's switch to our code editor. Here's our custom theme elements that we've been working with throughout this part of the course. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder. I'll name this blocks. Inside of the blocks folder, I'm going to create another folder. This will be the folder that will contain this particular block. Every time you want to create a custom block, you'll need to create a folder that will house the elements for that custom block. I'm going to call this one newsletter form. Now that I have that folder in place, I'm going to make some files inside of this folder. The first one is going to be called block.js. I'll make another file called block.json. Then we're going to need a file called render.php, and I'm going to create two CSS files. The first one is going to be called editor.css, and then I'll make one more CSS file called style.css. These are the files that we will need in order to make our own custom block. Now that we have those in place, let's go ahead and begin to modify some of the necessary elements throughout our theme. We'll start off by working with our functions.php file. We're going to need to create some custom code within functions.php. The purpose will be to register the block within our WordPress theme by loading the block from the directory. We're going to use something called register block type with the block folder path to make everything work correctly. As usual, I'll start off by making a comment that describes what this code is doing. What's happening here is we're creating a function that registers our custom block. To do that, we're going to use register block type. The path points to our block folder. So here we're getting our template directory and we're concatenating that to blocks and then newsletter form. The next couple of lines are where we bind register scripts and styles to the block. Editor script is where we bind JavaScript for the editor. This is typically using the React UI. Editor style is where we bind the CSS for block styling inside of the editor. And style is where we bind the styles for the front end part of our block element. We're using the add action hook so that we can hook these into init, which of course runs when WordPress initializes. The next bit of code that we need to add to functions.php is where we'll handle the newsletter signup. This is the form processor. To do this, we're going to create a brand new function. This part of the code handles the form submission logic for our block. We're going to use a conditional statement and we're going to make sure that the email is checked and sanitized. We're going to use WP Mail to send a simple email. This is setting up our email address, the subject line, and it will populate the email that the user enters into the form. You will need to replace this portion of the code with your own email. Then we have the WP redirect, which is redirecting to a thank you page, or it will redirect to an error page. Just like what we did when we created the contact form, we need to use exit so we can exit out of the script once this step has been made. Down below, we're using two add action hooks. These are the same as what we did with our previous exercise. The admin post no priv, and then the name of our custom block element is for non-logged in users. So this is going to handle public users. This one right here is going to handle logged in users. It is important that these hooks match the form's action attribute. We're going to create that in just a minute. We're going to need to add one more section of code. This will be where we register the blocked script and the styles. Once again, we're creating a new function. We're calling this VA custom theme register block assets. Inside of this, we're going to use WP register script. This will register the editor JavaScript, which is ultimately going to exist inside of block.js. This particular file is going to have dependencies of WP blocks, WP element, and WP editor. Then we're just identifying where the file is going to be located, and we're using the Boolean of true. This means it's loaded into the footer. Then we have WP register style. This will register both editor-only CSS, we're calling that editor.css, and our front-end styles, which we're calling style.css. We're using file time for cache busting. This is auto-versioning based on file modification time. The handles that we're using here are going to match the ones that are used in our register block call type, which we've coded up here when we registered the initial block. So our VA custom theme register blocks registers our custom block with WordPress. Our VA custom theme handle newsletter signup handles form submissions and sends emails. And our VA custom theme register block assets registers the block scripts and styles. I'll save my functions file, and now we'll move on to our block.js file. The purpose of the block.js file is it will provide the editor interface for the block. This is JavaScript written in React that will define how the block looks and behaves in the block editor. It generally includes how the block appears when added, any block settings or controls, and often we will use the edit function, which is something that we can use in the editor view. I'll enter the code and then I'll explain what it does. We'll start off by adding WP blocks register block type. This function registers a custom block with the name of VA Custom Theme Newsletter Form. Edit defines what the block looks like in the editor or the back end. We're also going to use save, and save defines what HTML gets saved in the post content. If this returns null, which is what we're doing here, the block is dynamic and rendered using PHP on the front end. This will be processed by render.php. Inside of our edit function, we are returning WP element create element. This is a React style create element, and it's used to build a mockup of the newsletter form. We will use this as a visual placeholder in the block editor. The form doesn't need to work in the editor, but we just want to be able to see it. The elements rendered are going to be a form, and we're going to add a class of newsletter form to that element. Then we're going to go ahead and create a label. The label is used for the email input. Then we have the input element itself. We're going to go ahead and define this input element as being a type of email. We'll go ahead and set some placeholder text, and we're making this required. The last element we have is our submit button, and we're going to give this a label of subscribe. It is important to note that the form will be non-functional in the editor. It's just going to give us a static preview. This prevents accidental submissions while editing the page or the post. The save function is the front-end output. When we return null, it tells WordPress that this is a dynamic block. The front-end output will instead be handled in our render.php file. Dynamic blocks are useful when you want the output to be processed by PHP. So it's great for forms, shortcodes, queries, or user-specific data. Just keep in mind that edit renders a static preview of the form in the block editor. Save and null prevent block HTML from being saved directly into post content, and render.php is going to generate the actual front-end form with the working PHP logic. So this block of code right here is going to register a newsletter block. It will display a form in the block editor in a visual manner only, and it's going to delegate the actual form rendering and processing to PHP, making this a dynamic block. I'll save this file, and let's move on to our render.php file. The render.php file is going to generate the dynamic HTML output for the block on the front end of our website. This is useful for server-side rendering or handling dynamic logic, like outputting a form, a shortcode, or post data. Let's go ahead and add the code, and then we'll break it down. We need to start off by making an empty PHP tag. This is used for server-side rendering of the newsletter form block. I'll go ahead and I'll add a comment in here just so that it reminds us what this is being used for. The comment is a good reminder that this file handles server-side rendering of the newsletter form block. The next bit of code will be familiar to you if you know HTML. We're going to start off by adding a form tag. Then we're going to use the action attribute. Notice that the action attribute is using PHP. This is going to ensure that we are using WordPress's admin-post.php endpoint to handle form submissions. Admin URL, and then in parentheses, admin-post.php generates the full URL or the absolute URL. Escape URL ensures the URL is safe and properly encoded for output in HTML. We also need to go ahead and pass in a method of post. This will send the form data via the HTTP post. And finally, we're adding a class of newsletter form. This assigns a class so that we can target it with CSS. Inside of the form, we're using a standard input element. We're setting the type to email, a name to email, and we have some placeholder text, and we're also specifying that this will be required. Then we have an input with a type of hidden. The name that we're using here is assigned to action, and the value is VA custom theme newsletter signup. This hidden input tells WordPress what handler function should process the form. The name action and the value of VA custom theme newsletter signup tie into this PHP hook. This is how WordPress knows which function to run when the form is submitted. And then finally, we have a submit button. This, of course, will allow the user to click and submit the form data. This file is going to output a real functional HTML form that submits to WordPress's admin-post.php processor. It'll send an email field and a hidden action field. It's going to trigger a custom PHP handler called VA custom theme newsletter signup. And we're going to be able to style it using CSS. It'll be easy to hook this because of the class. Let's save this file, and now we'll move on to block.json. Block.json is going to define our block's metadata and links to its other files, such as JavaScript, CSS, or PHP. This is the manifest that WordPress uses to register the block. We're using JSON, which you should already be familiar with. Some of this is similar to what we use inside of theme.json. We need to go ahead and specify the API version. This tells WordPress that the block uses the block API version 2, which includes improvements like simplified markup and better integration with server-side rendering. Then we're going to specify the name. This is a unique block name. The convention is usually namespace / block name. So here, VA custom theme is the namespace and newsletter form is the block. The same name must be used when registering the block in JavaScript with our WP blocks register block type. And you can see that this is exactly the same. The next element is the title. This is the human readable name that shows up in the block inserter within our editor. Next, we have category, and we're assigning this to widgets. This determines which section our block appears when we're browsing the block editor. Other categories that we have are text, media, design, embed, and theme. But this makes the most sense to me to include it inside the widgets category. Next, we have icon of email. This displays an icon in the block inserter. You can use any dash icon or block icons by name, and you can also specify a custom SVG. We're going to go ahead and provide a description. This is what will create the tooltip description in the block inserter panel. Next, we have supports, and we're setting this to HTML false. This will disable the edit as HTML option in the block editor. This is something that you want to do for dynamic server-rendered blocks where editing the raw HTML could break the functionality. Then we have editor script. This tells WordPress to enqueue a registered script via the WP register script to power the block editor behavior. We defined this inside of our functions.php file a little bit earlier. Next, we have editor style. This will load styles specifically for the block editor. We can use this to match the block's appearance while editing. Then we have style. This loads the front-end styles for the published website. It will also apply in the editor if needed for consistency. And finally, we have render. Render points to the PHP file that does the server-side rendering of the block. Since our save function inside of block.js is going to return null, this file will handle the output on the front end. The block.json file tells WordPress the block's name, the label, the icon, and the behavior. It also identifies what scripts and styles to use in the editor and on the front end, as well as identifying that the block is dynamically rendered via a PHP file and that it doesn't allow direct editing. I'll go ahead and save this. And at this point, let's go into the front end and test and see if we can see our new block element. I'll come to the backend portion of WordPress and I'll go into Appearance Editor, and we're going to go into Patterns and into our footer. Remember, this is where we actually want to enter this element. If I go into the plus sign and we go down to the widgets category, here are all of our widgets, and you can see we have a new widget called Newsletter Signup. If I hover over this, you can see that we get our description, a simple newsletter signup form. I'm going to click this, and as you can see, it's going to enter this particular block into WordPress. At this point, if we save our page and we go out to any of our pages and refresh, you're going to see our new email sign up appear inside of the front end. Now, we have not currently done any sort of styling on this, so we will go ahead and do that next. As you can see, there is no styling in the back end, nor is there styling in the front end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the code that we need for our CSS. We'll begin by creating styles inside of style.css. This will allow us to apply styles to the block on the front end of our website. It ensures that the block is going to look good when the page is viewed by visitors. I'll go ahead and begin by using a class of newsletter form. I'm going to tell this to display as flex, have a gap of half a rem, align items to the center, and use a margin top of 1 rem. Next, I'm going to target the newsletter form input, and I'm using a type of email. I'm going to add some padding, font size of 16, a light gray border, a slight rounding on the border radius, and I'm going to use flex of 1 and a max width of 250. For the button, I'm going to add some padding. I'm going to use my custom teal as the background color and my light gray as the text color. I'm setting the border to none, border radius to 4 pixels, and we'll specify the cursor to be a pointer. If we save this and we go back to WordPress, if I refresh the backend portion of WordPress, you can see that the styles are being applied here. If we go to the front end portion of WordPress and refresh, the styles are also being applied. Now all I want to do is I want to get rid of this bit of text right here. I'm going to go into list view and I'll just delete this paragraph. As you may have noticed, I do have one inconsistency. The email label shows up in the back end, but it doesn't show up in the front end. I don't really need it to show up in the front end, so we'll go ahead and make this a little bit more consistent. The reason that we're probably running into this issue is the fact that our label is only defined in the block editor and not in the PHP.render template. That's what's used on the front end. So if we go into our block.js editor, you can see that we do have the label, which is created right here. But if we look in render.php, we don't use the label. In order to make these a little bit more consistent, I'm simply going to get rid of the label inside of block.js. We'll save this file. And if we come back to WordPress and refresh the back end, you will see that the label has disappeared. Because I'm using placeholder text, I don't really feel that the label is necessary. And because I did not save getting rid of the paragraph, I need to just update that. I'll go ahead and save this. And if we come to the front end and refresh our page, this is starting to come together pretty well. The final thing I'd like to do is center this so that it's center aligned with join our mailing list. All I have to do is add one more line of code to my style.css. I'll go ahead and go to newsletter form, and we're going to add justify content center. Now when we come back and refresh, I think that this looks much better. Currently, we're not using our editor CSS styles, but let me just show you how we can alter what this looks like in the editor, just in case this is something you may want to do in the future. By default, the style.css file is going to style the block element in both the WordPress editor and the front end. But if for some reason you want your element to look slightly differently in the backend WordPress editor, you can go ahead and you can add some CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and target the newsletter form. I'm going to add a dashed outline and some padding. I'll save this. And if we go back into WordPress and refresh the backend portion, you can see how we now have this little dashed line around the particular element. If we go to the front end and refresh, we don't see that. So the editor.css file will only apply styles that you may want to include in the editor. For this particular example, I don't really feel like this is necessary, but I did want to show you this so that you understood that you can style the block element differently in the editor from how it would ultimately look in the front end. Now that I have this block element, I can add this anywhere I want. So we've placed it inside of our footer, but if I go back and go to one of my pages, and let's just say I go to the About page, and maybe I want the user to sign up for our newsletter. I'm going to go ahead and just make a heading here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'll use /. I'll start to type newsletter. You can see my newsletter sign up element is going to show up. I'll go ahead and select this. If we hit save and we go to the About page of our website, you'll be able to see that our sign up element is going to show up here. So we can basically use this element anywhere we want. If the user was to fill this out and send this, we're going to be redirected to our thank you page. This is the same behavior as when we built our contact form. And if we go ahead and check our email, or in my case, I'll open up Mailpit. I'm using local and Mailpit is built into local. It lets you see how forms are being submitted, and you can see right here is our newsletter sign up. It has the email that I used to sign up, and here is our subject line. Everything appears to be working just as it should. And there you go. You now know how to create your own custom block elements. This is a great way to enhance the WordPress editor and an additional way that you can further customize your theme. So if there are elements that need to be created that you might want to use in your website, and perhaps you would want to use a collection of elements, making them into a block element is a great choice.